Great. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. Welcome to the Investor Alliance webinar on Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Results 2020. Since 2018, we've been hosting this event with Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, and we are very pleased to partner with CHRB again to be able to share and discuss human rights reports for the investor community for the third year running. My name is Anita Dorette, and I'm the Associate Program Director with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. The Investor Alliance is a coalition of global institutional investors. We have more than 180 members across 18 countries, representing over 5 trillion in assets under management. Our members include asset managers, public and private pension funds, trade union funds, faith-based organizations, foundations, and family funds. Just a few quick logistic points before we get started. The first is that we're recording this webinar, and that the recording of the webinar will be available to all registrants shortly after this session. The second is that you are all muted at this time, but you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our amazing speakers later on. You can do this by virtually raising your hand by clicking on the hand icon right side of the screen, and we can call on you once we open it up for question and answer. Or you can also type your question into the comment box, and we will read this out during the question and answer session. So the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark is an annual assessment and ranking of global companies on their human rights performance using the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD guidelines. Since 2017, the CHRB has published 4 open and public benchmark reports of corporate human rights performance. This year's CHRB report assesses and ranks 230 of the most influential global companies across 5 sectors, including the automotive sector that has been added to this 2020 assessment. In order for investors to carry out their responsibility to respect human rights, investors need information on companies' human rights policies, processes, and performance. And benchmark reports like the CHRB provide critical data and insights for investors. Data from benchmark reports that rank companies against their peers allows investors to tap into the competitive nature of the market to drive for change. Following the 2019 CHRB results, the Investor Alliance organized an investor statement that was signed by 176 institutional investors, representing over 4.5 trillion in assets under management. Many of you investors are here today watching this webinar, and so thank you for that support. This statement was sent to 95 corporations, calling out their poor human rights due diligence performance as assessed by the CHRB in the 2019 report, and urging these companies to take steps to improve their human rights due diligence performance and disclosure. How did these 95 companies score in this year's reports? What should investors be doing to engage with their portfolio companies to get them to address human rights risks in their business operations? The COVID-19 crisis has exposed systemic, economic, and social inequalities across societies and throughout global value chains. There is an urgent need for change, for financial actors and businesses to come together to support an economic recovery that positively contributes to a new system grounded in respect for human rights. And so to learn more today about the human rights performance and how we can do this, we have 3 excellent speakers. And I'm just going to see if Mary has been able to join us. I think, Mary, you're there. If you are, could you just turn on your video? Great. Great to see you, Mary. So let me just do a quick introduction of our 3 speakers, and then we'll move on to the meat of this webinar. We have today Camille Lepause, who leads the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark at the World Benchmarking Alliance. She has been with CHRB since 2016 and has overall responsibility for producing methodologies and benchmark reports of key companies in high human rights risk sectors and engagements. Camille's experience includes working with Business and Human Rights Resource Centre in London, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and as an overseas member of the French Parliament in London. We also have today with us Marty Bohog, who is the Global Head of Sustainable Outcomes at Aviva Investors. Marty is responsible for Aviva Investors' efforts to support the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, across its 356 billion pounds worth of assets under management. She and her team delivers thematic research and engagement campaigns with companies and countries across 3 areas: people, earth, and climate, on issues such as renewable energy, deforestation, and racial discrimination. Throughout her career, Marta has worked at the crossroads of sustainability, finance, and public policy, championing sustainable investment in UK, the EU, and at the international level, and we'll be hearing more from her later. We're also very pleased to have with us Mary Roten, who is the Director of Global Sustainability at Ford Motor Company. Mary has been with Ford for 24 years and has held a variety of engineering, safety, strategy, and sustainability positions. And today, Mary is responsible to lead Ford's global sustainability program and identify emerging trends, develop company-specific objectives and strategies, and work with functional organizations to drive them into regional and global operations. She is actively engaged in product plans and strategies across carbon neutrality and sustainability. And Mary also leads the corporate social responsibility, sustainability indication, and the publication of Ford Motor Company's annual sustainability and ESG reports. So we have a really rich panel today that can give us different insights on these key findings today. And with that, let me hand off to Camille.
Great. Thank you very much, Anita and Nicole, for supporting with the organisation of this webinar. It's always a pleasure working with the Investor Alliance, and I'm really glad that we've got Marta and Mary also taking part in today's session. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So quick words to set the context. So the CHRB, Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, is part of the World Benchmarking Alliance. As Anita has mentioned, the mission of the World Benchmarking Alliance is to assess the private sector's contribution to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And within this, and on the basis that respect for human rights is at the heart of the SDGs framework, the CHRB looks specifically at the human rights performance of the largest global companies in sectors that have been identified as high risk for human rights impacts. So I'm really proud to present the 2020 results of the CHRB, which were published just a week ago. I did a similar presentation to this one last week at the UN Forum for Business and Human Rights, so apologies for some repetition if anyone listening in today also listened to the session last week, but at least today you'll see the slides. They didn't come through last week due to a technical issue with the forum platform, but I can see they're up here today, so that's good. The results I'm about to present are the 4th iteration of the CHRB, and this year we assessed just under 230 companies from 5 sectors, as Anita said, including automotive manufacturing for the first time. So could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And let's take a look at the automotive results first, given that it's the new thing this year. So we assessed 30 of the largest automotive manufacturers globally on 6 measurement themes and about 50 indicators per company. Anita has mentioned it already. The methodology that we use is grounded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs, as well as other globally recognized frameworks. The CHRB assessment is based on publicly available information in an attempt to drive more transparency on human rights issues in the private sector. And as part of the research process, companies have the opportunity to review their assessment and point us to additional public information, as well as ask questions on the framework before the results are finalized and published. Right, so that's probably enough framing. Can we have the next slide, please? And we'll take a look at the results for these 30 automotive companies. And unfortunately, these results are alarmingly bad. So on the slide, you can see the ranking of the 30 companies on the right-hand side. The graph on the left-hand side shows the number of companies in different scoring bands. So bearing in mind that the maximum score available is 100. So the average score for the sector is 12%, which is actually the lowest average score ever for a sector benchmarked by CHRB. And not a single automotive company scored above 50%. You can see that on the graph on the left-hand side. And actually half of them scored below 10%. These poor results suggest that implementation of the UNGPs is weak across the sector. But we have Ford Motors, Group PSA and Daimler emerging as leaders for the sector with scores ranging from 30% to 42%. And I'm really glad we've got Mary from Ford with us today. One particular area of weakness for the sector is supply chain management. So a majority of automotive companies failed to demonstrate that they work with suppliers or set core expectations through contractual arrangements to verify the age of workers, prohibit recruitment fees, and prevent intimidation or harassment of trade union members and their representatives. The 30 companies that were assessed by CHRB were also assessed by the WBA's climate and energy benchmark, and this enabled us to analyze how the automotive companies' results on human rights compared with their results on climate change. And this is important as the climate crisis is already threatening human rights around the world, but at the same time, any action taken to achieve a net zero carbon economy without consideration for human rights would only exacerbate existing inequalities and increase the potential for exploitation of groups that are already vulnerable. So here's what we found, and can we go to the next slide, please? So these results show that in spite of human rights and climate change being increasingly understood as issues that are inherently linked, almost no correlation could be found between a company's relative performance on either benchmark. So on the slide, you can see the automotive companies in alphabetical order, and there are two assessments on either side. So you've got the climate and energy benchmark on the left in green, and the CHRB results in red on the right-hand side. Some companies that demonstrated action on climate issues, such as low carbon transition plans, emissions reduction targets, or climate change oversight, disclosed very little, if any, information on how they manage human rights. And similarly, looking at it the other way around, some of the companies that score well on human rights relative to their peers aren't necessarily amongst the top scorers on the climate and energy benchmark. What this lack of correlation suggests is that many automotive companies still consider climate and human rights issues separately to be addressed independently of each other. And this is concerning, given that achieving success in both areas is essential to ensure a just transition. So going forward, we need to see improvements in both areas, but also a better understanding of how the two issues are actually linked. So now let's take a look at the results for the other 4 sectors assessed by CHRB this year. Great, thanks for the slide. So we also assessed just under 200 companies from the agricultural products, apparel, extractive, and electronics manufacturing sectors. All 4 sectors were already included in previous iterations of the CHRB. However, this year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we assessed them on a subset of the methodology. And we're actually also doing a survey into the company's response to COVID-19, which will be published in January. But for now, these 199 companies were assessed on 13 indicators, which we call the Core UNGP indicators, as they focus on high-level commitments, human rights, due diligence, and access to remedy, 3 core expectations of the guiding principles. Here as well, the assessment is based on publicly available information, and companies had an opportunity to feedback on their draft assessment before it was finalized. So what did we see? Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So first, too many companies are still failing to meet human rights due diligence expectations. So Anita mentioned already earlier this year, a group of 176 international investors sent a letter to the 95 companies that failed to score any points on the human rights due diligence indicators in the 2019 CHRB assessment. And in that letter, they called for urgent improvement. Of those 95 companies, 79 are still failing to score any points on the human rights due diligence indicators. And human rights due diligence is the process a business is expected to follow to identify, assess, and act upon its human rights risks. So as such, it's at the heart of any good approach to managing human rights risks, and is foundational for companies to drive sustainable change. And this is actually all the more imperative in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has laid bare but also exacerbated significant weaknesses throughout global value chains. These concerning results around human rights due diligence highlight the need for regulatory action, as is envisaged in the EU and elsewhere, to raise the bar for all companies. A second key finding is that a growing number of companies are actually getting better at the fundamental policy and process requirements of the UNGPs. So a few companies in scope are actually meeting most of the requirements in the 13 core UNGP indicators. And we have Unilever, Adidas, Eni, and Ericsson leading their sectors. However, we do see two significant challenges in spite of these improvements. The first is that it is still only a minority of companies that demonstrate the willingness and the commitment to take human rights seriously, as I've just highlighted with the human rights due diligence point, but also with the automotive results overall earlier. The second point is that we see in many cases a disconnect between commitments and processes on the one hand, and actual performance and results on the other. So even for those companies with robust commitments and management systems, these do not automatically translate at a practical level. And we've got allegations of severe human rights violations regularly raised, even against some of the highest scoring companies. This disconnect must be addressed to make sure that policies and processes deliver their intended effects going forward. A third key finding I wanted to highlight, and we'll need to move to the next slide for this one, please, is that negative human rights impacts are overwhelmingly felt in developing countries. So despite the fact that 78% of the companies assessed by CHRB are based or headquartered in OECD member countries, 85% of alleged impacts in scope of the assessment occurred in developing countries. And the countries where most negative impacts reportedly occurred were India, China, and Indonesia. Can we have the next slide, please? We've got 104 of the 229 companies assessed this year, so that's all sectors together. 104 of these companies had at least one allegation of causing, contributing, or being linked to human rights impacts that were severe enough that they met the CHRB severity threshold. And that gave us a total of 225 allegations in scope this year. You've got the breakdown on the slide of the reasons for those different allegations. And whilst we do not assess the allegations on their merits, what we do assess and look at is how companies respond to them. So we see that companies engage in a dialogue with stakeholders in less than 1/3 of cases, and that they provided remedy that was satisfactory to the victims in only 4% of cases. I also wanted to briefly go through some findings for each of the sectors. So for the full detail, I'd recommend that you go to the website or the key findings report, but I wanted to pull out a few key findings for each of those. So if we can go to the next slide, please, I'll start with agricultural products. Thank you. So we had 57 companies in scope in the agricultural product group, and they achieved an average score of 10.3 out of 26 on those CHRB Core UNGP indicators. We had 9 out of 10 agricultural product companies with a grievance mechanism or participating in a shared mechanism, which allowed workers to raise complaints regarding human rights issues related to the company. However, when it comes to external individuals or communities who may be impacted by business operations, only half of companies had a grievance mechanism accessible to these groups, and only 21% of them described the approach taken to enable timely remedy for victims of adverse human rights impacts. Now looking at apparel, and can we go to the next slide for this one, please? Thank you. We assessed 53 of the largest global apparel companies this year. They achieved an average of 9 out of 26 on the CHRB Core UNGP indicators. And when it comes to respecting the rights of workers, just under half of companies had a commitment to the ILO core labour standards and expected their suppliers to explicitly commit to respecting each of those rights. This is concerning for this sector, given the high levels of risk for many factory-based workers, many of whom are women, and therefore we need to give greater attention to addressing what are often chronically unsafe working conditions and exploitative labour practices going forward. Looking at the extractive group, and thank you. Can we go? Yeah, perfect. We had 57 companies which achieved an average score of 10.2 out of the 26 points available. 86% of those extractive companies had commitments to engage with potentially and actually affected stakeholders, such as workers, their families, local communities, or could demonstrate regular engagement with these groups. However, when we look at whether this engagement informed the development or monitoring of their human rights approach, then we go to only a third of companies. The reason I wanted to highlight these findings specifically for the extractives group is that these companies often have significant impact on the locations where they operate, and therefore taking into account the views of all stakeholders that are potentially affected by these operations is crucial. And finally, and this will be the last sector, but taking a look at ICT manufacturing, can we have the next slide? Brilliant, thank you. This sector was assessed for the first time last year, so it was their second iteration this year. So we looked at 44 electronics manufacturers. They achieved an average score of 7.9 out of the 26 points available on the core UNGP indicators. And even though this is lower than the average in the other sectors assessed on the same subset of the methodology, the ICT group is actually improving at a faster rate than the other sectors. When it comes to respecting the rights of workers, just 14% of these companies had commitments to the ILO core labour standards. So further improvements will be urgently needed, especially in the context of rapid growth in demand for electronic devices and utilities, which can place workers in the ICT manufacturing sector at a greater risk of exploitation. So overall, in spite of encouraging results for some companies, the 2020 results paint an alarming picture of the state of implementation of the UNGPs, and that's by the largest companies in high-risk sectors. And this is as we approach the 10-year anniversary of the principles, and as we only have 10 years left to achieve the 2030 agenda in time. So what we need to see is systemic change, and we need to see it now. It must come from the private sector itself, but also be supported by all the stakeholders that can influence corporate behavior and push for better practices. So these include, of course, investors, but also policymakers, civil society groups, industry groups, consumers, etc. in order to support this very much needed change, I encourage all interested stakeholders to check our results in more detail and to be part of the movement towards more responsible and sustainable business practices. Thank you, and back to you, Anita.
Thanks for that, Camille. Lots of information for us to digest here, and really very insightful conclusions that you've drawn. Thanks so much for that, Camille. And with that, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Aviva Investors was one of the key stakeholders that launched the CHRB benchmark in 2013, and who better to give us the investor perspective than Marta Borhaug, and to understand how this data has helped with Aviva's engagements and what challenges they have faced. Marta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thanks as well to the Alliance for hosting this, and thanks to Camille for presenting the results. I think I just want to make a couple of key points from just around how we see this as an investor and why it matters. So first of all, and I doubt that most investors will disagree with us on this, but I think it's an important point to kind of bring us all back to, which is that for us, there is no question that respect from human rights is not an option. So I'll start with that because, you know, for us as an investor, human rights isn't an issue that comes sort of second or third after climate change, etc. Human rights is a baseline. Respect for social issues has to be one of the foundations for companies, and so that is partly why we're pleased to have been helping to set up the CHRB. We care about it because it's material, in part because you know, we've seen sort of over the last couple of years and even longer, the last couple of decades, seeing a lot of corporate failures leading to big hits on a company's bottom line, whether it's financial loss, legal liabilities, risk to their business, operational delays. And so from my perspective, I think it's important to make that point because investors care about this, and if they don't, they should care about it because this is an issue that matters materially to the business. I also think that it's worth us all kind of reflecting. I'm sitting here at home and the sun has gone down here in London, and you know, we're all working from home because of COVID, but COVID-19 has definitely shown us the huge importance of companies' social responsibilities. And as Camille was saying, it probably brought to the forefront to most investors and also to most of our clients, and as well as our customers more broadly, the value that how companies respect human rights and how companies deal with these social issues is actually you know, hugely important. And so that is just to sort of, yeah, give a bit of context of why we care. So how do we use all of the results that Camille shared with us, and what's our view on this year's results? So a couple of thoughts. I think first of all, it's worrying to see what I would call so many persistent laggards. So Camille was talking about, you know, sectors where we've been ranking them for a few years now. There's still quite a lot of companies that don't seem to budge and don't seem to kind of move up the ranking. The idea of a ranking is to let the market work its magic, to get companies to rise and wanting to compete, to have better practices. But I think what we're seeing is a worrying trend of persistent laggards. And all I would say there is that shows in some cases the need for government intervention. So I think Camille called for a broader coalition. I'd call out for governments around the world to be a bit bolder in certain areas where we do need minimum standards. We've seen some positive movements on that around the EU that is now moving towards mandatory human rights due diligence. You know, we can't always expect that every single company will do everything perfectly, and I think it might be a challenge if some companies are free riding on what others are doing and some of the good companies are doing. So we may hear a bit from Mary later about what they're doing as a company, scoring reasonably well in the automotive sector. But what we might want to do is to get government support to get sort of companies up from a minimum bottom. I think a second point I would flag on this year's results that Camille highlighted as well is that we need to look beyond just carbon. I think investors have very successfully been engaging with companies on climate change with multiple big coalitions, really pushing companies to set bold and net zero targets. And I think 2021, my hope is that that will be a good year for us to really put human rights and go beyond carbon and put human rights on the agenda. And part of the reason for the prioritization in the investor community is probably the sort of urgency that you had clarity around the Paris Agreement, and you saw lots more evidence coming out to the sort of the risk of not thinking about climate change, and lots of regulation coming out at the same time, creating this wave for a really big investor alliance on climate change. What we really need now is a greater push on human rights, and I think the results that Camille pointed to, that gap, is one that we're looking to address over the next couple of years. And my hope is that all the work done by the UN Working Group on Human Rights next year will help make 2021 a strong year for human rights. I think a final point to leave you all with from my perspective, though, is that there is some and sort of I'm a positive person, and I try to look optimistically at where have we seen some positive change and where can investors make a difference. So over the last year, as Anita was mentioning as well, we've sent out letters to companies who were scoring 0 on human rights due diligence, and there are actually I think there's 16 of them that have lifted up from 0. I mean, it's a small progress, but it's worth showing that a benchmarking and increased transparency and investor pressure can lead to some positive change. Similarly, at Aviva Investors, we also vote. So we think it's important for investors to put their, not just sort of send a letter, but actually put their votes behind what our views are, and vote against companies that are not taking action. And we're pleased again to see that of the companies we voted against last year, we're seeing I think we voted against 39 companies last year based on the 2018 results. This year we've seen 23 of those companies improving. So I think if there is a hope to leave people with, it's that we believe that companies can improve. We believe that benchmarking is the right thing to do, with a bit more of government push around setting some minimum standards. We have sort of great hopes for a positive dialogue between investors and companies and all the wider stakeholders. And what I'll flag very, very briefly at the end is just, I think, having engaged in some conversations with companies on human rights, it's really important to strike a good dialogue and have a good positive discussion around how companies can improve on human rights. And to do that, it's really important that we do not sort of encourage companies not to have any issues or any incidents. I mean, we talk often about find it and fix it and prevent it. So we want companies to find these issues, to find the human rights issues in their supply chains, because any company that says they don't have any issues, like Camille was talking about serious allegations, we would expect serious allegations across multiple parts of a company's supply chain. The issue is not whether we find it, it's making sure we find it, and then making sure we address it, as was highlighted as well. So hopefully we can hear a bit more from Mary in terms of how a company goes through that process. But I think it's really important that we as investors make sure we have good, strong, long-term dialogues with companies, so that we have an understanding of that, and that companies are not scared of voicing that they've identified issues in their supply chain. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully a couple of highlights on how we both use the research, why it's valuable, and also the importance of really strong dialogues with companies.
Thanks so much for that, Marta. Very insightful and a lot for us to discuss. And, there is a lot of actions that investors can take. And hopefully that, some of that discussion will come out, and we'll also try and define some, consolidated and organized actions that we as an investor group can take forward. With that, with the automotive sector being part of CHRB this year, we are very fortunate to have Mary Roten to tell us how Ford Motors has tackled human rights risks in their operations, and how engaging with investors has been an important part of that process. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today. As Anita mentioned, I'm Mary Roten. I lead Ford's Global Sustainability Team. I used to lead Ford's Global Supply Chain Sustainability Team, something I always get used to saying. Today, I'm going to speak about our interest and experience with the 2020 CHRB launch. All right. Ford has a long history of respecting human rights throughout our company. And I, first of all, want to say I completely agree with Marty that actually the prior slide, Marty, that human rights is the baseline. Human rights is a material issue to Ford. And what we have on the slide that states reflecting on 20 years is just a slide that talks about our history of human rights and respecting human rights throughout our company. We have a legacy. Ford's been around since 1903, and we have a history of respecting human rights throughout our company. For example, in the early 1900s, we started the $5 workday for assembly line workers that more than doubled the average pay of the day. And we also institutionalized the 40-hour work week. Fast forward to the late 90s, and Ford was one of the first companies to publish our first ever sustainability report called Connecting with Society. It was actually called our Corporate Citizenship Report, and I'm really pleased to say that we've just published our 21st consecutive sustainability report. In 2003, we published our first human rights policy letter for not only our company, but our suppliers. We joined the UN Global Compact in 2007. In 2014, we became a signatory to the UN CEO Water Mandate. In 2016, we became a signatory to the UN SDGs, as well as the first automaker to join the Responsible Business Alliance, and that's developing, RBA, if you're not aware, is an organization to help develop sustainable suppliers. In 2018, we conducted our first saliency assessment, and I'm really pleased to state that when we did so, we linked human rights expectation with environmental expectations. We found 3 environmental issues such as climate change, air quality, and water to be human rights issues as well. Also in 2019, we signed the CEO Action for Diversity. And moving on, earlier this year, we were the first global company to join the UN Women Empowerment Principles. We're very proud of our long history in human rights. And from our CHRB assessment, we know that we have even further to go. Next slide, please. So CHRB for automotive has really occurred at the right time, especially when companies are trying to define human rights practices in a standardized way. As we heard earlier, CHRB is such a very high bar for companies around governance and policy commitments, embedding and respecting human rights due diligence, remedies for grievance mechanisms, as well as company performance. Now I'd like to share an example of how Ford found it, fixed it, and prevented it, if I can use Marty's explanation earlier. We received the initial CHRB framework in January of this year, and we took it very seriously to try to understand how Ford could improve. We identified gaps as well as opportunities for improvement. We found a couple areas that we realized that as a company, we were already doing these things. We just were not disclosing them. So we decided to, in our 21st annual sustainability report launched in June, we decided to disclose some of the actions that were taken. And here's a very specific example. As I mentioned earlier, Ford's a member of the RBA, and we conduct supplier audits as part of our RBA membership. When we conducted one of these audits, we found that a supplier was using recruitment fees in Taiwan. After we found the issue, we worked very closely with the supplier to have the supplier reimburse those employees that had to pay recruitment fees. And we made sure that not only were those employees paid back, but we also worked with the supplier to develop new policies and procedures to prevent it from ever happening again. Our team really believes in developing sustainable suppliers. So when we find an issue, we work with those suppliers to fix it, and prevent it from happening in the future. The CHRB assessment has really helped Ford increase our transparency. And the one thing that I like the most about it, it provides a standardized method to measure progress on human rights performance. And this has never occurred before within not just the auto sector, within cross sectors when the first CHRB came out in 2017. So let me go into the next slide and I'll give another example of how Ford is actually using the CHRB data. To developing a standardized way to track and measure social sustainability, including human rights, has been on our minds for a while. In fact, we developed a joint partnership with the UM Institute. It was actually a 2-year partnership to find a standardized way to track and measure social sustainability, with human rights being one metric within social sustainability. And the reason we took on this project is because when we talk with our colleagues and we talk about climate, everyone can think off their top of their head the 5 basic metrics to track for climate. But what we wanted to take on is what are those 5 basic metrics that people think of, or 4 metrics as you see on the screen, for social sustainability. From the work that we did, and as I mentioned, it took us over 2 years to conduct this project. We interviewed over 100 internal and external experts, including many investors that are on the call today. We interviewed our dealers, we interviewed people within the local community partners, and we came up with a very simple model to measure human progress, defined as preserving human rights, protecting human health, safety, and well-being, increase access to societal good, and enhance economic prosperity. And when we look at this model, we wanted this model to be applicable not just for auto, but for any type of sector. So Ford Motor Company's increasing access to societal good is increasing access to transportation. We also believe, and we also used under the preserving human right category, the metrics for preserving human right are the corporate human rights benchmarking metrics. We think the CHRB is a very thorough methodology, and it's really showing companies how they can improve in areas that they never considered improving, and we've incorporated it in our model of human progress. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering any type of questions you might have.
Thanks so much for that, Mary. Thanks for sharing some insights into how Ford really, digs into the issues to tackle human rights risks, and how that also partners with the climate change work, which has been kind of a hot question that's been coming out through the questions and answer sessions. So again, participants, please post your questions in the question and answer box and not the chat box, so that's easier for us to coordinate. And in addition, any of those who want to ask questions directly, please feel free to raise your hands. So with that, let's start the question and answer session. And can we have all the panelists on, please? Great. I see Mary. Maybe we can have a gallery view. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks so much for that. So, I mean, one of the important questions, actually all of you addressed this during the time that you spoke, but I guess the participants want to understand, how do we really kind of bring together the human rights, the companies' actions to tackle human rights and environmental impacts? How do they bring that together? There seems to be, how do investors coalesce around it, and how can companies assess this together? I'm not sure anyone wants to try and take this view. And I think there was also a question on, what does just transition mean? So maybe I'll throw that to Camille to kick off, and then I'll ask Marty and Mary to both comment as well.
Sure, and that's a really good question. I think the idea is that companies should recognize that the climate risks and the human rights risks are linked, so they can't be treated completely separately. I mean, I think often there are actually different teams in companies working on the two issues and not necessarily talking to one another about what's the best way of addressing those risks. And I mean, perhaps Mary has insights into that and how it happens in Ford particularly. But so, yeah, the idea is to recognize the two are linked, to make sure that they can be addressed together. And in terms of the just transition, so it's making sure that we transition to a net zero carbon economy, but that in that process, we don't leave anyone behind and create actually negative impacts on the people whose lives we're trying to improve through moving to a net zero carbon economy.
Thanks, Camille. Mary, yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that when we conducted our first saliency assessment in 2018, we had many external stakeholders helping us develop our list of salient human rights issues. A big investor that we work with, the Investor Advocates for Social Justice, as well as the ICCR, Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, series, RBA, amongst, I think we had like 7 or 8 external stakeholders. When we were all on the phone working to develop our salient human rights issues, it was so clear to Ford that human rights and the environment are completely intersected. This planet provides life support, if you will, to the people within the planet. So we need to make sure that the planet is protected because it protects the human rights. And the two are just so very much interconnected. And Camille, I will mention that since I have responsibility for both human rights and social sustainability, it was really easy to make that connection. But I will say it wasn't, our idea alone. I have to give a lot of credit to one of our vice presidents who is now retired for the past, I want to say 10 to 12 years, Sue Siskey. She was the very first person at Ford that ever came out completely interconnecting human rights with the environment around the right to water, not just water accessibility, but clean and sanitized water. So it's been something that's been on the mind of Ford for a long time. We were able to really formalize it through our saliency assessment and talk about it.
No, that's great. And Marta, before you answer that question, I'm just going to add on another question so that you can tackle that straight away, which is, you mentioned about using your vote to drive change. I think a lot of the investors want to understand what that means more, and if you could give some examples.
Yeah, happy to. I think on the broader challenge of bringing environmental issues together with social issues, I think there are sort of good and challenging trends inside the investor community. I think on a good positive note, what we have is lots of interest from, increasing interest from investors in engaging and voting and taking action on human rights. And we have lots of investors also taking action on climate change. And so all we need to do is actually just sort of tally up those sort of, you could almost argue they're slightly separate discussions, separate engagements, and in some areas they need to be because we're targeting a particular issue. But what we should be committing to as an investor community is making sure that when we're going out to talk to companies, we need to ask those questions at the same time and encourage companies to think about it together. And so that's sort of, I guess, sort of on a positive note, there's interest from investors in both areas. But I mean, I don't know about Mary, but how often has she been in a meeting with investors addressing both issues at the same time? I think as an investor community, we can tend to sort of start to focus heavily on one and then sort of in a separate collaborative initiative address another one rather than bringing them together. So that's probably more of a lesson learned for us as investors. I mean, from our perspective as Aviva Investors, that's exactly why we've established or sort of worked together with lots of other allies, governments and others to establish the World Benchmarking Alliance, which, the CHRB is part of. And that talks about system transformation across 7 systems. So it's not just about social, it's also not just about climate change, it's also about biodiversity, it's about lots of different issues as we're trying to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think for us, thinking holistically about this and looking at data from different angles is essential, and hopefully initiatives like the World Benchmarking Alliance will help us do that. On the voting, just very briefly, there are lots of different ways you can vote. You can vote against a report and accounts. You can vote against the re-election of the chair. There are various ways to escalate it across your voting policy. So my only encouragement would be for investors to start somewhere and start to see how they can embed it more broadly in their core voting policy. The other aspect is to look more towards resolutions. I mean, Anita, you know very well, and might want to add a comment on sort of, you know, broad resolutions in this space. But I was looking back on this year, and Aviva investors have been voting in favour of a lot of, I think actually all of the human rights resolutions that have been put forward at company AGMs. Unfortunately, I think none of them passed. Some of them were very close, and so I guess my only encouragement would be for investors to have, in the same way we've seen climate change resolutions starting, you know, a couple of years ago, not having a lot of support. Now they're getting majority level support and really pushing companies to take action. Perhaps 2021 can be the year when we saw the tilt for human rights resolutions as well.
No, great, Marty. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think you've covered that really thoroughly. So thanks. I know, Camille, you had a quick comment before we jump into the next question, and I'm also conscious of the time, but.
Yeah, I'll make it very, very brief. It was just to add on the question between the disconnect or needed connection between human rights and climate, because I saw another question in the chat was around why do we think automotive companies are scoring so low on average as a sector? And I think this could be one of the explanations, the fact that a lot of the focus has been on the climate angle and, you know, the emissions for car manufacturers, and that might have diverted some of the attention away from the human rights questions.
No, thanks for that, Camille, and you know, crucial point, and it's about, you know, moving in that one direction. And with that, I actually have two questions for Mary. Mary, so since you're going to comment on it, I'm just going to put two questions to you as well, and if you can take them all together. So, I mean, one of the key questions, and I think you kind of addressed it a little bit, is the fact that how do investors support your work to ensure that, you know, pushing for more human rights embedding into processes will help you to do, you know, throughout the company will help you. What can investors do to support that? And the second question is, has COVID forced Ford to rethink its approaches to human rights, in particular at the workplace practices? So over to you, Mary, and then after that, we might actually wrap up. But please, Marta and Camille, please jump in as well with your comments to wrap up those questions. Yes.
Okay. I'd like to start off by saying we've seen a big trend at Ford that's been happening in the past year. Investors are not only asking us about the environment, but they're asking us about human rights. And I think that would be the first thing that I'll share with all investors is ask the companies in which you've made investments in about their human rights performance. In fact, I just had a call 2 days ago talking all about the work that Ford's doing on human rights. So when the investors ask the question, it gets high level visibility within the company. And please ask us the questions. We at Ford are happy to share. And if there's areas that we need to improve, we want to hear that. You know, we don't always look at things from the same lens that you all might look at them. And if you find an opportunity for us, share it with us, and we'll definitely look into it. We may not be able to act on every single item, but we'll definitely take all the items under consideration. So definitely please ask us. And I want to make a comment on the why so low. As I talked about earlier, that what's tracked is measured. And CHRB, what it's done for the auto industry is really set a baseline for companies to see how they perform, not just within their own sector, but cross-sector. And now that we know where we perform, now that we know where we're at, we can find opportunities on how to improve. And I think that I have to give a lot of credit to CHRB for developing that standardized methodology, not just comparing companies against each other, but providing us a way to improve, because it is a very high bar to achieve. So huge kudos to CHRB on setting the bar for us really high. The last thing on human rights and COVID in the workplace, that's a great question. I'm working from home. I'm in right outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, working from home. And I have to say, some days I love working from home, and other days, you know, when my kids interrupt, I just wish I could go hide out in my office somewhere. So the answer to the question is yes, our workplace environment has changed dramatically. And a lot of employees enjoy working from home, but there's some days when we want to go in the office. So you'll be seeing a blend from Ford in the future and allowing great flexibility to employees to allow them to work wherever they want to work in order to get the job done. So thank you for that question.
Marta, Camille, anything to add to that?
Just a final thought again about the breadth and the depth of the information we get from CHRB. There were some questions in the chat regarding, you know, there's a lot of ratings out there, there's data you can be buying in. Our challenge to that data is that it often doesn't show the full picture, and it very quickly can become, it can help us give us a sort of quick sense of a company, but quite often it doesn't tell the full story, like we've seen with some of the companies mentioned on the chat. So in our view, it's up to investors to make sure they have the resources to understand the company more fully, that they are, you know, using the data from independent benchmarks like the CHRB, and also, I guess, encouraging that data to be publicly shared so that all stakeholders can benefit from it, and therefore we can sort of push for change and push towards that top high benchmark that Mary was mentioning together, so that companies and investors and governments and stakeholders can work together. So the public nature of CHRB is really valuable as well.
Yes, and to just add to that as well, I mean, there has been questions about other data providers, and, you know, as investors, in order to carry out our responsibility to respect human rights, we should be pushing our other data providers who provide ranking information on encompassing broader human rights indicators, and really taking that into account in their ranking space. I think that's very inconsistent. So we as investors, if we ask for this information from our data providers, this will drive more disclosure. It really is a circle of work that needs to be done. Camille, did you have anything to add on to this? If not, I'd just like to do a quick wrap up.
Sure, just one thing, and I won't go into it, but I saw there were a few questions, and actually builds quite naturally on Marta's last point around the call to action, because I've kind of painted a rather negative picture, but wouldn't want to leave people with the impression that there's nothing that can be done. So we've got a call to action for companies, for investors, for policymakers, for civil society. So it's all in detail in the key findings report, which is available on the website. So if people want to act on all this, I invite them to check this out.
Right. So, I mean, you know, thank you everyone for attending. And really, as investors, we want to see human rights due diligence at the core of managing human rights risk, and you know, to drive the sustainable change and support the sustainable goals. That's really what we want to see. And as investors, you know, there are a number of things that we can do, and many of them were discussed on this call. So engagement with companies, in any of your engagement on issues, bringing up this data, CHRB data relating to human rights due diligence, you know, just raises that, really pulls together the issue to human rights due diligence processes, which is very important. And as we ask for more of this information as well, our colleagues like Mary is able to go to management and to boards to say, this is information that investors want. We need more resources, and we need to focus and implement this. This is really part of that work. So please, you know, that kind of engagement and really voicing your opinion is important. And we also ask, and also to ask companies to disclose it. It's not, they need to know and to show that they respect human rights. And that really is about the race to the top in terms of human rights performance. Voting, as Marty mentioned, and as well as supporting legislation, mandatory human rights legislation, non-financial disclosures, Modern Slavery Act disclosures. All of these are things that investors can support to ensure that we are really raising that bar. And just finally, you know, we've talked about the investor statement that we launched earlier this year, which was sent to 95 companies. we did see some improvement, and a number of those companies were companies where our investors have had sustained engagement. So it's not about a one-off event, it's about sustained engagement over years. And investors are really collaborating as partners with the companies they own to raise that level. So we're asking investors to build that collective leverage to really engage with companies. And we're reopening for signature the investor statement, calling on companies to improve performance on corporate human rights benchmark. And in this statement, we're really calling for companies who have scored 0 or just scored really poorly to demonstrate their respect for human rights by conducting human rights due diligence. So we're going to share with you that link at the end of this through an email. And if you have any questions on that, please, feel free to ask us. We are a little over the hour, so really thank you to the wonderful panelists for sharing your insights and information, and really the optimism and the positivity about moving forward. Thank you to the amazing questions. We have a lot of questions that have come in. I will share that with the rest of the speakers, and we will email a lot of you back on some of those answers. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share them with me, and I'll direct it to the panelists. All right, so with that, thank you and goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.